All right, let's get started. We're going to cover some topics such as URL and the internet and client-server model and HTTP. Now, those four are practically the basic theory of the internet. And for any web application, understanding those are a must. And of course, we're going to cover the three main languages on the web, which is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Those are the three core languages that is being used to program a website. But before we get any further, I'm going to first introduce who am I. My name is Devin Han. I enjoy programming, visual art, and music. I am a member of my school's robotic team. This is a cringy picture of me playing violin in a Civil War reenactment. And I'm currently a 10th grader, and like Jerry said, I'm the vice president of the club. If you're interested in learning more about me, here's my website link. All right. So 67 people, a lot. That's a lot. What is HTTP? To understand the internet better, you have to understand resources on the internet. So the internet is full of all types of resources, and they're hosted by specific machines. So the internet is full of those resources, and they're hosted by specific computer, some machine, and those machines are what we commonly call a server. So that's server demystified. There are just some machines out there on the internet that is hosting a resource. You could, through the IP address of that machine, access that resource and fetch it to your own computer. And that's how when you type in google.com in your browser, that is how you get the resources from google.com. And HTTP, which stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, is a way to format your message. Now, I love to explain this in an airport analogy, where imagine that you're a person in the airport and you saw another person. So you walk up to him and ask, where is the coffee shop? The language that you guys are using, which is English, is your protocol. And in terms of web development, that language is HTTP, the way you format your message. When that person on the other side, when he understands your message, whether you're speaking English or French, if he understands it, in terms of web development, that is your server understand your message, it will send you a response. So you ask, where is the coffee shop? If it doesn't know it, he should send a response of, I don't know. If they do know it, it will give you the correct address of the coffee shop. And that's the same thing when you type in google.com in your browser is sending a message to google.com formatted in the HTTP protocol. Google server will understand your message through HTTP, and if they knew that what you're asking for, they're going to give you back the page. If they don't know, they're going to tell you they don't know. And that is why you see 404 on websites. That just means they don't know. All right. So you probably have heard I use word request and response. HTTP itself is a request and response model. That means a server will only talk to a client if a client specifically asks for that resource. Usually, you will send your request to a server, and then the server will look at your request. It will try to parse it, or parse in terms of understand it. When it understands your request, it will send a response back to you. That's basically how almost all the web application works. You sending a request, it look up the things that you might need, and it send back you a response. Now, if the response is an HTML file, which is a file we use for browsers, your browser will draw it on the screen, and that is how you see all the web pages. When you type in a link, you're sending a request to the server located on that link. That server located on that link will process your request and send a response back. And if that response is HTML, the server will just render it. Now, let's see some example of HTTP request. This is what it usually looks like. Get means getting a resource. Host is the domain name. And this is what a request looks like. There's a lot of content, but mostly it's telling the browser what kind of stuff it's asking for. Here's the content book ID equals, that's the stuff they're looking for. And the response is almost the same, except there's no verb here. So that's a client-server model that we briefly mentioned, where a client, whether a web browser, a command line interface, a program, will send a request to the server, like what I'm doing right now. If I search up google.com, I'm sending this request to Google's server. And this server of Google will process that request and send me back a response. And that's how I get this page right here rendered. That is because the Google server sent me an HTML file, and my browser can understand HTML, so it draws a page on my screen. Now we got all the theory out of the way. Let's start coding about HTML. This is the first website that ever existed in the world. If you're interested, you can look it up. It's just called the first website. I forgot the link too. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. It's called markup because you tag your text as specific elements. Now, it's kind of hard to grasp what does tagging mean, but when we get to coding, you'll see it very clearly. And browser will draw your content according to how you put the tags there. Now, this is a document that the browser rendered for the world's first website, and their code might look something like this, which is much less complex since this is the first website, but that's the idea behind HTML document. You have this code here that your browser will understand, and it's specified to the browser what content are there. Now, if you only have HTML, your website is just gonna look this way. You can't have this cool UI of Google. You cannot have this cool user interface of YouTube. If you only have HTML, your website is gonna look this way. The way you create those highly interactive, beautiful contents is through CSS, which we're going to get into later. For now, I want to start coding right away. So, for coding HTML, you could literally just create a text document and change your ending to .html and open it with your browser. But for convenience, we're going to use some online editor called REPL. This is an online editor that allows you to type in your code and instantly see the change. The link is repl.it. If it's first time, oh, oops, I typed it wrong. The link is repl.it. And if this is your first time logging, let me show you how you register an account. You click on
sign up, and then so I put your email in.
Yeah. You could use your Google Chrome account, or you could just make a new account. I'm just gonna use my Google account. So Now if you're on this page, you should look to your right, and there's a button called New Repo. I recommend you code along with me, but the idea is fairly simple for introductory purposes. So if you don't want to code along, you can just watch me do it. You would click on New Repo to open a new repository. For languages, you would scroll down and choose HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It will give you a random name. I'm just gonna. Now we have this kind of boilerplate thing here. This thing is not for rendering purposes. This part is called your metadata and is tagged in the head tag. So you see this kind of tag a lot. Don't panic if you see this kind of tag. What it does is just tell the browser that everything inside a single tag will be of that element. That means the browser will render it according to what you tag it as it is. So a tag usually looks like this, where you have this kind of notation, and inside the notation you will put your tag name. For now, I'm gonna make a paragraph tag, and I will call it P. That's the name for the paragraph tag. To close the tag, you simply do same notation but /p. That's how you make a semantically correct enclosing tag. Now, this tag, whatever you put inside this tag, will be called its content or its child element. Let's say if I put this paragraph here will be the content of this paragraph tag, and your browser will understand it as a paragraph. Now notice here we have HTML tag, head tag, meta tag. Those tags won't actually get rendered. Those are some special tags. HTML just tells the browser this is the start of this document. Head tag tells the browser this is metadata, the data about this document, like the title, the char set is the character encoding, and also the language would be put here. This is a link to external CSS, which we'll get into later. For now, we don't need this. This is a link to JavaScript. We don't need this right now too. The important part here is this body tag. This is where you put all your HTML content here. So let's copy and paste this paragraph tag into the body tag. If we click run, Repo will automatically host a cloud website for us in this link. And we should see that on our editor on this side. On this side, we have this is a paragraph. That is because the browser taking this tag. Now, it will work if you don't have the tag. Browser automatically render any text. That's because when the browser was invented, it was primarily used to transfer text. But it would be the best practice to enclose all the paragraph inside a paragraph tag. And also, a p tag is something called a block element. Now, this is probably the only important thing you have to remember: the difference between a block element and the inline element. If you don't put anything, if you don't put any tags, like if I were just to write this line, hello, straight inside body tags, without any other tags, this is called an inline element. It will be rendered inline, and it won't contain its own line. Let's just see how it works. Notice here I have a inline element, an element without any tag. let me make another text here. This is also an inline element, which means it won't have its own line. Everything that is not inside a tag is automatically seen as inline. Now you might expect if I were to run this, it will show hello and the next line world. Actually, it's gonna run this way, a perfect hello world. Let me add a comma here. All right, perfect. Now that is because those elements without a tag will be treated as inline elements, and inline elements just means they won't have their own line. So they're gonna be in the same line. How do I make them into different lines? Well, I simply have to put a tag that is a block element to mark this as a block element. So I'm marking this world text here with a p tag. And this tells the browser that this world is actually a paragraph. And since paragraphs should be rendered in a block fashion, have their own lines, this world element will have this own line. So you see we have this hello world. That's probably one of the most important concepts for pure HTML. Let's make more sense. I have another p tag, and this is another line. You get the idea, right? If you have any question, feel free to put them in chat and I will answer them. I highly recommend you open up your repo and code this line into your repo. A pro tip here for learning how to code is see as much examples as you can and copy those examples, because your brain will automatically pick up the patterns shown in the examples. Now we introduce this p tag. There's a few more elements in HTML that we're going to introduce. Those are called browser default elements. There is a span element, which is almost the same thing as if you were to put it not inside a span element. Span element is a special element that is inline. That means it won't have its own line. So you see, even though we did an enter here, this element will still be in the same line as hello. That's because it's also an inline element. Now the difference between a span and not marking span is pretty subtle. I will explain it later. To make your text cooler, there's other inline elements that you could use. The first one is called strong. You probably could guess it will bold the text. You see, I marked another as a strong, and when browser sees this tag, it knows that it has to draw this another here, a strong. So here you are, this is another line. There's also italicized or something. If I remember correctly. There's also I, which means italicize, and it just italicize the line. Now, what you could do with browser, with those browser provided elements, are pretty limited, and that is why you need to write your custom CSS. CSS is really where all the magics happen. There's only two things that for now you need to know about CSS. Those are really important. You gotta remember those very well. The first one is a concept called Css Selector. What does it do is the Css Selector allows you to select a specific element on the HTML document. So let's say I want to change the span tag a little bit. Maybe I want to move it to the right a little bit. Or maybe I want to change its color to red. Well, I'm going to first use a CSS selector to find this element and then tell the browser to color red. So that's the idea behind a CSS selector. Inside here, the way I would select a browser-defined element is just writing span. This is our selector. So now all CSS that we write here will be applied to all the span tag. So let me repeat this part. This is a selector and it select all the tag that is marked span. Inside of this part, this is where we write all the CSS styling. And we usually use a pretty neat syntax, a column and a semicolon. On the left of the column, we will put whatever thing we want to alter. On the left of the column, we could put color, we could put margin, we could put size, font size. On the left of the column is basically everything that is related to the style of the element. On the right is how should you want the style to be. If I were to put this here is select the span tag and it gives a CSS of color equals to red. So you can see the effect it has. Just on the left is whatever style you want to change. On the right is whatever you want it to be. There's tons of CSS style that you could alter to make your website look exactly like google.com or whatever they have. Right now we're just using color and we could change the span tag to red. So that's the first important concept, the idea of a selector. Of course, selector won't be that simple. Can you guys try to select a paragraph element and make it blue? So notice here, we put span here to select a span element and we color it red. Can you guys try to select a paragraph element and color it blue or whatever color you want? All right, if you're being brave, can you please paste your code in chat? All right, nice, perfect. You're missing a semicolon at the end, but good job, good job. The way you would do it is by doing p.color. This way you see all the paragraph. Everything we marked as paragraph will be blue. But if I were to have a span inside of world, right now I am putting a span element inside this paragraph tag. If this happened, that span element, although inside of a paragraph, will be red. That is because the browser will render it according to the closest rule, and in this case, span is apparently closer to this red text here, then span is of course closer to this text than world. So this content is first span, and that is why this content here is being drawn red. Notice how now we can select paragraph, we can select span, but what if we want this only this paragraph to be selected, and what if we only want this part to be blue? We only want this part to be blue, and we don't want this part to be blue. How would we actually do that? Well, yeah, nice question, John. That is exactly what I'm going to talk about. Now, Jack, changing P would make a new element, and that's called making your custom elements. That's a way to do it, but that's not the recommended way. Usually, the way to do it is by writing a class name to it. So let me find this part. We only want this part to be blue. What we want to do is write class equals to, if you came from my C# course, this class is pretty different from that class. This is literally saying that all selector, oh sorry, there's no dot. All selector that selected my class name will be will apply to this element. So see here, it is still blue because although it is of my class name, it is apparently still a paragraph element. If you want to change only this my class name specifically, let's remove this line. What we want, so now they're all black. What we wanted to do a dot. Notice this dot here. This dot is used to select element of that class. So in the class name, there's no dot, but here you need to put a dot to select a class. When there's no dot in the selector, it means select an element of that tag. When there's a dot in the selector, it means select an element of that class. In this case, is my class name. We would select this. We want this part to be blue. After we draw it perfect, this is what we see. Only this element with class, my class name, became blue, and this paragraph, this is another line, is not blue. If we want other stuff to be blue, let me create another tag. We simply have to give it the same class name as the blue class. So we give this class my class name, and we also give this class my class name. Now both of them are going to be blue, but this is unaffected since this doesn't have the same class. And that's the way we select the class. By doing this, you can create some really colorful elements already. A challenge I will leave for you is to try to create some sort of alternating color, where you would have one paragraph as red, one paragraph as blue, one paragraph as red. Let me do it first. By the way, this is not the way to name CSS. Better way is my and this mark and no capitalization. So the challenge I'm leaving to you is to create a document where there's one line that is blue, one line that is red, one line that is blue and another line that is red. Alright, something like this. Oops. Never mind. I'm writing my selector to select all the element with class of name red class, and I'm changing their color to red. This is how I talk with the browser to tell it how to draw stuff. Alright, if you're hopefully you have this effect here. This is a code for the effect where I put my class name for the first line, and I give a class of red class to the second line, and a class of my class name to the third line, since I marked my class name, this class, to blue. And for the fourth line, I just give it red class, and that's how it became red. Alright. So far it's pretty easy, right? Hopefully it has been pretty easy. There's tons of more CSS selectors out there. For example, for this purpose, we literally don't have to write those lines, since there's a CSS selector simply called ends of child, but we won't get into that for now. Those are some advanced CSS selector, and if you're interested, a great resource to look for is W3 School. They contain some of this selector basically select ends of child of paragraph element. And you could change selectors, you could add them up. For example, if I were to put P and my class name, now this will actually select all of the my class name that is inside a P tag. So this way, you see that those blue won't be blue anymore, even though they have the class of my class name. They're not inside, they're not child element of a P tag. To make it blue again, we simply wrap them around in a P tag. Oops. Alright, so this means that the class must be contained by whatever is previously preceding it. So for some reason P wasn't working, so that was pretty embarrassing. But you get the point. I put body here, and all of our HTML content are inside the body tag, of course. So that is why my class name started to work now, since they're contained inside of a body tag. Alright, I hope you guys all understand the first important concept of CSS. Now, right now, even though we have some colorful documents, this still looks terrible, right? It's nothing compared to Google, compared to this website, even compared to repo. It's nothing compared to this website. That is why we need to introduce another important idea. And this is called box model. This box model will apply to all elements that is of display block. Now, a review time. An element with display block is like paragraph, where it has its own line. It make a new line in contrast of display inline, in contrast of inline elements. A block element simply has its own line. So box model will apply to all the block elements. It specifies whatever margin it could have. So this is very obvious here. If you can See this graph? The content is where our text goes. So for this paragraph element, the content will just be hey blue. And margin is the distance between this element and other element. In this case, this part between the two elements is their margin. And padding is how much space. Usually we use padding when we have defined space, but padding is kind of like a second margin. It means how much space there are between the border of the content and the actual content. If you have a large padding, it will squeeze out the content and the border more. If you have a smaller padding, the border will be right on the content. And border simply mean the border of the content. So how do we actually do that? Let's just take our red class as an example and give it a border. Now the 3-box model border is the middle one. Let's try to give it a border. The syntax to give a border is border pixel. This part defines how much pixel are there. In our case, 2 pixel. Solid. This means the styling of the border. It could be dashed. It could be solid. And it has all kind of style. If you want to look up what kind of style you want, you should simply search up CSS and in some documentation you see there's a lot. Dotted, dashed, solid. For now, let's just use dash. And the third one defines what color the border should have. For our case, red. Now you see we have this very ugly border around this content. From my experience, most web developer today, they don't use this dashed for border anymore. That just makes their website looks 10 years from the past. You don't see the dash border. So most of the times they just use solid border. All right. You could also only add one border, like just bottom. The way we do it is border dash bottom. Let's say 2 pixel solid black. And this way we're simply editing the border on the bottom of the element. So you see we have the border on every other side as red and on the bottom as black. So now we only have the border bottom. So this is the syntax to go for border. Pixel, how wide it is, and solid, which just means the styling of the border, black, the color. Now a trick is use border radius. This just makes your border circular. The pixel value defined here is of some complex math. But the way to do it is the larger the pixel value is, the higher the radius will be. So there will be more arc. The lower the border radius is, there will be lesser arc. You see here, I have the small tiny arc here, which looks kind of good. After I added border radius, if I have border radius as 50, it's gonna give me a gigantic arc. Now we introduce border. Margin time. In our box model, there's border, there's padding, and there are margin. We're going to introduce padding the last, since there's a most controversial one, and is highly related to width and height, which we haven't introduced yet. For margin, the way you do it is simply selecting margin. Margin, you can give it 4 value: margin top, margin bottom, margin right, margin down. So let's give the red class a margin top of 50 pixel. Notice how the red class is moved down from it. That is because it needs to have a 50 pixel distance between the blue class and itself. If I inspect the elements here, I click on this button and I go to here. You see here that this margin, this p.red class, this element, it has a huge space on the top, and that is because we define margin top to 50. And same idea, if you want to put a margin on the bottom, you simply do margin.bottom. A lot of people like to draw with CSS, and those people includes me. CSS is a great drawing tool, I'm not kidding. So if you master it, you could literally create amazing art with CSS only. You see now I have margin on the bottom. A block element will take up the entire width of the website, but you could specify it to make it not take up the entire width. So you see here, this hey blue, even though it only has 2 words, is gonna take up this entire line, and all the other elements had to start a new line. So that's the full line property of a block element. If we only wanted to take up some space, the way to do it is specify a width. Let me just set width equals to 2 pixels. You see that this get wrapped around. If I inspect element, this actually have a really tiny width. It is that blue on the it is that small blue, but since HTML render whole word, it is getting rendered that way. But let me make it bigger. It's 20 pixel. There should be not enough space. All right, so you see that I made it 50 pixel, and there's enough space for 2 words on the line. Notice how even though this only has 50 pixel, meaning this entire section on the right side is actually empty. This line still started on a new line. That is still because of the property of a block element. It always would start on a new line, no matter how much space there are on the previous line. It always starts on a new line and occupies the entire line, unless you specify a width, which is what we did here. You could also specify a height, which is pretty straightforward, right? Let's just make it 1000 pixel. Notice this entire height is actually, even though it's empty, is occupied by this element of red class. So that is why we want this part to be blue. This part is so down below. Another property is called background color, or just simply background color. Say it's blue so we can see it better. So since we have border radius, this is circular. And notice how it occupies this entire height here. Since we marked it as height 1000 pixel. And now we removed that line. This looks this way. If we remove width 50 pixels though, it's gonna take up the entire width of the browser, since that's the way the block elements work. That's it for the block elements and box modeling. Hopefully by now you could already draw some pretty amazing stuff with the browser. The browser will flow naturally from top to down. So if you want to add something parallel on the same line, you would use something called float. But that's out of the scope of this class. If you're interested, you could search up float in HTML in CSS. Another way to do it is called Flexbox, and another way to do it is called grid. But those are really high-level concepts, so for this introductory class, it won't be covered. By now, we have this amazing document here. Let's actually make it look prettier by formatting it. So what we wanted to do is some kind of blog site where we'll have a large header section at the top and some text at the bottom. So I'm gonna remove all the markup I have, since they're simply just messy now. I am going to use an element called div. This is almost the same as the paragraph tag, but it doesn't have to be a text. The difference between a div and a paragraph is that a div could contain anything and is block based. That means it is a block element. A paragraph element has to be text. So a div element could be text, and it could also contain images. Let's create a div. It's also a great way to contain all your elements, to group them together. Let's call this header. Here we're not going to put anything, and instead we're going to draw on the web page using purely CSS. We use the dot notation to select this header class. This class ends at 3:30 or 3:35 depending on the. All right. So we have this header tag here. Let's refresh it so there's nothing. Remember how we would do this. A block element contains the entire width of a web page, and its height is specified either through your CSS or whatever content are there. So if we just put div here, it's gonna have the entire width of the web page, but 0 height. If we were to put a letter here, it's gonna have the height of this letter. We're not gonna do that. We're going to specify the height in CSS. A pixel is, of course, a pixel on screen. If it's 300 pixel, and to make it visible, we give it a background color. You see, we have this header around our web page now, and this is a link to your web page. If you haven't, you could type. I'm not gonna do that because repo hosting is not that stable apparently. The height is 300 pixel, and we draw this large div on the screen. Pixel is just a value type. There's other value types such as viewport height. A viewport height is a percentage based on how high the viewport is. So a viewport height of 1%, one viewport height means that this height will be 1% of the entire height of the viewport. If it's 50%, it's going to take up half of the screen height. We mark it as 50% of the viewport height. So if you learned percentage before, congratulations, it's going to take up 50% of the screen height. Of course, if the screen is higher, it's going to take up more. So this is something called a responsive unit. It could resize as the screen resizes. If I make it really small, it's going to get really small. If I make the screen really big, it's going to get really big because we're using a responsive unit. All right, we have our div here, which looks pretty good. I don't like this blue, so I'm going to make it. I don't like this purple either. All right, we have this blue here. Now we could put something. No, remember you could put a tag inside another tag to make them a children of that parent tag. So now we're going to make a children paragraph tag inside this div tag of header. So let's make a paragraph tag. And you see we have welcome to my cool website. You could, in your CSS, style your paragraph tag to make the font looks bigger. You do this by doing font size and just specify how large you want it to be. But another way to do it is simply mark it as H1. H in this case stands for header. H1 means the largest of header, and from H1 to H6, the size of the header decrease eventually. For H1, it's going to be a really big header with bold. H4 is going to be much smaller. So you get the idea. Now, this is not exactly what we wanted. We kind of want it to be centered. To center an element inside a div element, to center some text inside a div element, we simply do text align center. Now you see that welcome to my cool website is now centered. If I make it shorter, you can see it better. This is centered on the top of the screen. Before that, it was centered on, it was aligned on the left if we didn't put the text align here. But since we put it there, it's going to be centered. And I don't like this color, so let's change the color of this element. To select the H1, we should give it a class, so we only select this specific H1. Let's call it I'm just going to call it header text. And we select the header text. You can call it whatever you want. Now you see we have this header text. We selected all elements with class of header text. And so we selected this one. And we change its color to white. So now it has a color of white. I want it to be centered a little bit. There's a few ways to do this. One way is through doing Flexbox, but since we don't have time to cover Flexbox in this lesson, I'm just gonna do something called BR. A BR just break a line. Just add some space here. you see that there's more space. BR just add a space. It stands for a line break, and it just literally add a empty line here to break a space. Or also we could add margin top 50 pixel. All right, so I guess this is not that responsive, but whatever. If so, BR is not the way to go. We have this cool website now. Now you see that we have this margin top to 50 pixel, and instead of pushing this element on top against the parent div, it actually pushed the entire header down 50 pixel. And that is because this is the element directly above, directly on top of the header. And this is something called margin overlapping. It's a problem a lot of programmers face. A way to do this is simply adding a padding bottom. You just have to add this line to whatever container it has. In this case, header. If you add patching, never mind this. The patching bottom way is apparently outdated. You could do just add another element there, like BR, and this will separate the margin of H1 from the margin of div. So that way, the H1's margin won't push the div up. It will only push itself, the H1, down. It won't push the entire div down as well. So right now we have it centered. Cool, we have the header now. Let's make another paragraph. Outside of this header. Call it, I am going to call it main text. You can call it whatever you want. I'm just gonna put a lot of gibberish here. Alright, that's enough. So it looks like this, which doesn't look that good. Let's style this a little bit so we can lead with something that's good looking. I'm just gonna use all the styling that I taught, so you should be able to follow along. I'm gonna mark the width. Since right now it's overfloating the window, I'm gonna set the width to something small, like 500 pixel, or I could do something like 60 viewport width. This is another responsive unit, and it stands for viewport width. It literally means the width of the entire screen. So 60 means just 60% of the width of the entire screen, which will be pretty small, but this is the element that we used previously. This is the styling we used previously, and it basically gives a margin on the left side and on the right side. Repo is kind of slow. Alright, so now we have this here. This is still overfloating. I'm going to try something to fix the overfloating. But that's all we wanted to achieve today. Alright, so we open this up, and apparently the overflowing is because of the repo window. And in the real world, it looks like this. I'm gonna copy a lot of lorem ipsum. This is just dummy text, and put it there so it looks like a paragraph. This is still a little bit too short. Now we can only define the margin left and margin right, and we don't have to define the width now, since we told it that we want 20 pixel of margin on the left, so it should move 20 pixel to the right, and we also have 20 pixel margin on the right side, so that means it should have 20 pixel distance from the right side of the screen, and in that way the width is automatically defined. 20 pixel from the left side of the screen, 20 pixel from the right side of the screen. The browser will calculate the width for you. Now here we notice we have 20 pixel on the right, 20 pixel on the left. This is still kind of big. I'm gonna set it as 200. All right, so that's all for today. Now is the Q&A section. If you have any question, you're free to ask. You're free to lead now, and you can ask any question you want.
A little question.
Yeah.
I just like really interested about what are we going to do next class.
Next? You mean next class or just next?
Next class.
Oh, next class we're going to cover some more advanced CSS styling, like remember the Flexbox I mentioned? Those elements allows you to create some cool content like parallel contents and make your website really looks something like this, really modern through Flexbox. And
got it. Like we are doing CSS to make our website prettier next time.
Yeah, looks, because right now we could only have the content from bottom to down. We also want content from left to right.
It's boring. You just can use HTML, don't know like a little bit about CSS.
Yeah, true. HTML is just plain text, and CSS is how you make it looks prettier. And we might also cover animation in the next lesson, depending on the time. All right, thank you guys all for coming, and a few resources for you is W3 School. I already introduced this one, and if you want to learn by yourself sometime. Another one is MDN Web Docs. Those are good resources. And also Stack Overflow, a place where you can post questions. And that's it. Thank you guys for coming.